A United States senator is trying to use the floor of the Senate to stop the president from taking America into a war with Iran. Not after the war starts. Right now, before the first direct American military strike happens. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia has been pushing for floor votes on a resolution that would limit what Donald Trump can do militarily against Iran without coming back to Congress first. And the fight over whether that vote even gets to happen is one of the most important constitutional battles playing out in Washington right now, even though most people aren't paying close attention to it. Stay with this, because by the end you're going to understand something about the war powers debate that almost never gets explained clearly in political coverage. There's a specific constitutional argument at the heart of what Kaine is doing, and understanding it tells you something much bigger than this one story. It tells you about a decades-long shift in how America decides to go to war, who actually holds that power, and whether Congress is capable of taking it back. Here's why this story matters right now and why it's bigger than one senator pushing one resolution. The United States Constitution says that Congress has the power to declare war. That's not ambiguous. It's written plainly in Article 1. But for the last several decades, American presidents of both parties have conducted significant military operations without a formal congressional declaration of war. They've relied on broad authorizations, executive authority arguments, and the practical reality that Congress has been slow, divided, and often unwilling to force a direct confrontation over war powers. The result is a system where the president has accumulated enormous practical authority to initiate military action, and Congress has largely let it happen. Kaine's push is an attempt to interrupt that pattern at a specific and consequential moment. The question of whether he succeeds and whether Congress actually forces a vote on limiting Trump's Iran options will say something important about whether the legislative branch is capable of reasserting a constitutional role it has largely ceded over time. Let's start with exactly what Kaine is doing and why he chose this particular approach. A war powers resolution is a specific legislative tool. It allows Congress to force a debate and a vote on whether the president can continue military operations without explicit congressional authorization. The original War Powers Resolution, passed in 1973 after Vietnam, requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to hostilities and limits the duration of that commitment without congressional approval to 60 days. That law has been contested and debated ever since it passed. Presidents of both parties have generally argued that it represents an unconstitutional limitation on executive authority. But it remains on the books, and it creates a procedural pathway for Congress to force a vote even when the majority leadership would prefer not to have one. What Kaine is doing is using that pathway. He's pushing for a resolution specifically directed at limiting Trump's military options with Iran. The practical effect of such a resolution, if it passed, would be to require the president to get explicit congressional authorization before taking direct military action against Iran beyond what's already been authorized. The political significance of the push goes well beyond whether the resolution actually passes. It forces every member of the Senate to go on the record. It creates a public debate at a moment when the administration would prefer to keep its options open without a lot of congressional scrutiny. And it puts the question of war with Iran directly in front of the American public in a way that a quiet internal White House debate does not. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. The real obstacle Kaine faces isn't the merits of the argument. The real obstacle is whether Senate leadership allows the vote to happen at all. In the current Senate, where Republicans hold the majority leader controls what comes to the floor for a vote. That means that even if Kaine has the procedural tools to force a debate, the question of whether an actual binding vote happens depends on whether Republican leadership is willing to allow it. And that decision is being driven not by constitutional principle, but by political calculation. Republican senators who might privately have reservations about open-ended military action against Iran are being asked to make those reservations public. Most of them would rather not. This is the core political dynamic that makes Kaine's push both important and difficult. He's not just fighting the White House. He's fighting the structural resistance of a Senate that has, for years, preferred to avoid direct accountability on war powers decisions. It's much easier for senators to criticize military decisions after the fact than to cast votes before the fact that constrain a president of their own party. Kaine is trying to take away that comfortable ambiguity. Now this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the war powers debate isn't a purely partisan issue, even though it often gets framed that way. There are Republican senators who have expressed genuine concern about the scope of presidential war-making authority. Rand Paul of Kentucky has been the most consistent Republican voice on this issue. He has pushed war powers resolutions himself under both Republican and Democratic presidents. He's made the argument consistently that the constitutional requirement for congressional authorization is not a Democratic talking point. It's a founding principle that should constrain any president regardless of party. The question is whether Paul and any other Republicans who share his concerns will join Kaine in forcing a vote. If even a handful of Republican senators cross the aisle on this specific question, the dynamics shift considerably. It becomes much harder for Republican leadership to simply block the vote without facing criticism from within their own caucus. It gives the resolution a bipartisan character that makes it more difficult to dismiss as simple opposition party politics. And it creates a coalition that is harder for the White House to manage quietly. Whether that coalition forms depends on what happens on the ground in the conflict with Iran. Right now, many Republican senators are inclined to give the administration room to maneuver. They don't want to be seen as tying the president's hands in the middle of an active and escalating situation. But if the conflict escalates in ways that make direct American military involvement more likely, if American personnel face direct threats, if the costs of continued involvement start to become more visible, the political calculation for those senators could shift. What feels like strategic deference to the executive today could start to feel like political exposure tomorrow. And what happened next changed the entire calculation for how this constitutional debate is being understood outside Washington. Because Kaine's push is happening in a media environment where the Iran conflict is getting significant public attention. The question of whether America is heading into another Middle East war is one that large numbers of Americans have strong feelings about, across the political spectrum. Polling has consistently shown that Americans are skeptical of military interventions that don't have clear objectives and exit strategies. That public sentiment creates at least some political pressure on senators who might otherwise be content to stay quiet. Kaine is clearly aware of this dynamic. His push for floor votes is not just a legislative strategy, it's also a public communication strategy. Every time he goes to the Senate floor to call for a vote and gets blocked or ignored, he creates a news story. That story keeps the war powers question in front of the public. It puts Senate leadership in the position of having to explain, again, why they won't allow a vote on whether the United States should go to war with Iran. That's not a comfortable position to be in indefinitely, especially if the conflict continues to escalate. Let's talk about the constitutional stakes here, because they're genuinely significant and they're worth understanding clearly regardless of your political views. The question of who decides when America goes to war is not a small one. Wars have enormous consequences. They cost lives, treasure, and political capital. They reshape the international standing of the United States. They create obligations that can last for generations. The Constitution's framers understood that, which is why they gave Congress, not the president, the power to declare war. The reasoning was straightforward. Going to war is too consequential a decision to be made by a single person. It requires the deliberation and accountability that comes from having the people's elected representatives vote on it publicly. That principle has been eroded significantly over the past several decades. The Korean War was fought without a declaration of war. Vietnam was fought based on the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which was passed based on information that later turned out to be misleading. Iraq was fought based on an authorization for use of military force that was passed before all the intelligence assessments had been fully scrutinized. In each of these cases, the executive branch moved faster than Congress could effectively deliberate, and the consequences were severe. The argument for what Kaine is trying to do is rooted in that history. Before the United States gets drawn into a direct conflict with Iran, Congress should have to vote. The American people, through their representatives, should have to say yes or no. The counterargument which the current administration and its supporters will make is that requiring congressional approval before every military action makes the United States less able to respond quickly to threats, signals weakness to adversaries, and creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. That's also not an unreasonable argument. There are genuine situations where speed and decisiveness matter in ways that a full congressional debate cannot accommodate. The question is whether those situations apply here, or whether the Iran situation is exactly the kind of significant, consequential, long-term commitment that the Constitution requires Congress to weigh in on. That debate is not going to be resolved by Kaine's resolution alone, but the resolution forces it into the open. It makes senators take a position. It puts the constitutional question directly in front of the public at a moment when the stakes are real rather than theoretical. Now let's think about what the longer-term implications of this fight are, regardless of how this specific resolution plays out. The war powers debate has a long history of being raised, partially engaged with, and then set aside when the immediate political pressure subsides. After the Iraq War, there was significant momentum to reform the authorization for use of military force framework, to put clearer limits on what presidents could do militarily without coming back to Congress. That momentum produced some proposals, some hearings, some reports, but no fundamental change. The institutional inertia is very strong. Members of Congress generally prefer not to cast votes that can be used against them in future elections. Voting for a war that goes badly is politically damaging. But so is voting against military action that later gets framed as necessary for national security. The safest political position for most members is to avoid the vote entirely. Kaine's push is a direct challenge to that institutional preference for avoidance. And it's a challenge being made at a moment when the consequences of avoidance are particularly visible. If the United States enters a significant military confrontation with Iran without Congress having formally weighed in, and if that confrontation produces the kinds of complications and costs that critics are warning about, the question of why Congress didn't act when it had the chance will be very uncomfortable for a lot of senators. The political history of American military interventions suggests that congressional silence at the beginning tends to become congressional criticism at the end. Members who said nothing when the decision was being made find it very easy to express concerns once things start going wrong. Kaine is essentially trying to force accountability up front rather than waiting for it to come retrospectively when the costs are already being paid. Whether that effort succeeds in its immediate goal of producing a vote and potentially constraining the administration's Iran options is uncertain. The political obstacles are real, but the effort itself matters. It keeps the constitutional question alive. It creates a record of who pushed for accountability and who avoided it. And it establishes a standard that will be relevant in the next conflict and the one after that. Here's the bigger picture this whole story is pointing at. Tim Kaine pushing for floor votes on Iran is a small story in the daily churn of Washington news. But the question it raises is one of the biggest in American governance. Who decides when America goes to war? The answer the Constitution gives is clear. The answer that decades of practice has produced is very different. And the gap between those two answers is where a huge amount of risk lies. Not just the risk of any particular military decision going wrong, but the risk of a democratic republic gradually losing its ability to govern its own use of force. That's a risk that should concern every American regardless of party, regardless of views on Iran, regardless of how you feel about this administration or the last one. The fight Kaine is having right now is one piece of a much larger constitutional story that is still being written. If this kind of analysis is useful, subscribe. This channel covers the stories inside the political headlines that actually matter for how the country works. Leave a comment with one question about war powers, congressional authority, or what you think should happen with Iran. Those conversations are worth having. And if you know someone who is paying close attention to what's happening with Iran and wants to understand the full picture, share this video with them. Because understanding the constitutional dimension of this story is essential to understanding the story itself.